Grace Thompson's hands trembled as she dusted the silver frame in Alexander Hartford's study. The boy's face in the photograph made her heart stop. "Boss, that boy grew up with me in the orphanage," she shouted. What Alexander revealed next would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd been serving for 3 years. Grace Thompson had learned 3 essential rules during her 22 years of domestic service. Never ask questions, never make assumptions, and never, under any circumstances, look too closely at the personal belongings of the people who employed you. But on that humid Tuesday morning in June, as she dusted the mahogany shelves in Alexander Hartford's private study, all 3 rules shattered in the span of a single heartbeat. The silver frame caught the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hartford mansion. Grace had dusted that particular frame dozens of times over the past 3 years of working for Alexander Hartford, but she'd never actually looked at the photograph inside. It was positioned on a high shelf, angled away from casual viewing, as if Alexander wanted it there but didn't want to see it every day. Today, however, Grace was using the ladder to reach the upper shelves, a deep cleaning that Mrs. Patricia Hartford, Alexander's mother, had specifically requested before the family's annual charity gala that weekend. And from this elevated position, Grace found herself staring directly at a face that made her cleaning cloth slip from her fingers and fall silently to the Persian rug below. The boy in the photograph couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He had sandy blonde hair that stuck up in the back, a gap between his front teeth, and eyes that held a mixture of mischief and sadness that Grace recognized instantly, because she had seen those exact eyes every single day for 6 years of her childhood. The photograph showed the boy standing in front of what appeared to be an orphanage, though not just any orphanage. Grace would recognize those brick walls anywhere, the distinctive arched doorway, the oak tree in the corner that she and the other children had climbed, despite Sister Margaret's constant warnings. St. Catherine's Home for Children in upstate New York. The same orphanage where Grace had lived from age 7 to 13, before being placed with a foster family. The same orphanage where she had met Michael Chen, the boy who had been her best friend, her defender, her family when she had no family. "No," Grace whispered, gripping the ladder so tightly her knuckles turned white. It can't be. But there was no mistaking it. The face in that photograph belonged to Michael. Her Michael. The boy who had shared his dinner with her when she first arrived at St. Catherine's, terrified and alone. The boy who had taught her how to tie her shoes and told her stories to help her fall asleep when nightmares woke her. The boy who had promised they would be friends forever, no matter what. The boy who had vanished from St. Catherine's one autumn day when Grace was 12 years old, adopted by a family whose name she never learned, leaving Grace behind with a hole in her heart that had never quite healed. Grace's breath came in short gasps as memories flooded back with overwhelming force. Michael stealing extra cookies from the kitchen and splitting them with her behind the gymnasium. Michael standing up to the older kids who teased her for being the quiet one. Michael crying the night before his adoption, telling Grace he didn't want to leave her, that she was his real sister, even if they didn't share blood. "I'll find you someday," he had promised, his 8-year-old voice breaking with emotion. "When I'm grown up, I'll find you and we'll be family again. I promise, Gracie." But he never did find her. And after years of waiting, hoping, searching through social media and adoption registries, Grace had finally accepted that Michael was gone from her life forever. She had built walls around that pain, learned to function without constantly wondering what had happened to the only person who had truly understood what it meant to grow up unwanted, unloved, invisible. And now here was his face, staring at her from a silver frame in the study of Alexander Hartford, one of the wealthiest men in New York. "Why?" Grace breathed, her voice barely audible. "Why does Alexander have Michael's picture?" The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent a jolt of panic through Grace's body. She scrambled down the ladder, retrieved her fallen cloth, and was halfway across the study when Alexander himself appeared in the doorway. At 34 years old, Alexander Hartford was everything Grace was not. Wealthy, educated, confident, and completely at ease in the world that Grace had spent her entire life serving from the shadows. He stood 6 feet tall, with dark hair graying at the temples, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of tailored suit that cost more than Grace earned in 3 months. For 3 years, Grace had worked in the Hartford mansion, maintaining the invisible presence that good domestic workers perfected. Always there when needed, never noticed otherwise. Alexander treated her with distant politeness, the way one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that performed its function adequately. He never raised his voice, never complained, and never, in 3 years, had a conversation with her that lasted longer than 30 seconds. Which is why the expression on his face when he saw her standing frozen in the middle of his study sent ice through Grace's veins. Alexander's eyes moved from Grace's pale face to the silver frame on the shelf, then back to Grace. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition, or something else Grace couldn't identify. "Grace," he said, his voice careful and controlled. "Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air between them. Grace's mind raced. She had violated the first rule of domestic service. She had looked too closely at something personal. She should apologize, make an excuse, return to her work, and never mention the photograph again. But the words that came out of her mouth were nothing like an apology. "Boss, that boy grew up with me in the orphanage!" The shout escaped before Grace could stop it, years of buried emotion erupting in a single desperate cry. Her hand flew to her mouth in horror at her own outburst, but it was too late. The words hung in the elegant study like shattered crystal, impossible to take